Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for taking the time to attend this afternoon's presentation here. Yeah, I'm really going to enjoy talking about something I think we're all passionate about, performance optimization. I've presented several times before here at TSAC. This is the first time I'm presenting at the University of Pittsburgh. So at Pittsburgh, our laboratory, we've been working with performance optimization injury prevention for the past 25 years. Initially starting out with sports injuries with collegiate and professional teams. Over the last 10 years, we've worked pretty closely with the Department of Defense and a lot with the Special Operations Forces. So at Pittsburgh, not only do we have our three professional sports teams, the Steelers, the Penguins, and the Pirates, but we also have a very innovative and culture of academic excellence. That building in the middle there is the Cathedral of Learning, which is a very well-known landmark in Pittsburgh. One of the unique things we do at Pittsburgh, especially with the Department of Defense, is we have a number of different remote laboratories. And in fact, we have one laboratory here working with the Naval Special Warfare in Coronado. The unique aspect here is we do a very detailed physiological assessment of all the energy systems, aerobic, anaerobic, muscle strength, body composition. You can see here in the slide is a neurocom that assesses vestibular function, and that's going to become very important as we become very interested in concussion and traumatic brain injury. By the way, at the University of Pittsburgh, the IMPACT Clinic is the largest concussion clinic in the country. And those of you who may have seen the movie Concussion, that was based on a University of Pittsburgh physician who was the first one that identified the impact of concussion in football players and really took on the NFL. But the main thing I want to draw your attention to on this slide is the lower right-hand corner, which is an individualized sort of a readiness report. So that's one of the things that I think is very important as we talk about performance optimization, is to individualize programs and also to give detailed reports. So this report here, a strength and conditioning coach or a military leader can pinpoint a potential weakness in an operator or a tactical athlete, and subsequently design a program to improve upon that weakness to improve soldier performance and reduce injuries. The importance of performance prevention, of performance optimization has been very well known. Here's a quote from Sun Tzu, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. And, going on to modern times, I'd like to show this slide. This was a paper that was published in 2010. It was actually a report written by over 40 retired admirals and generals, really a call to action in terms of how we're feeding, how we're utilizing physical activity in our secondary schools. Simply, we're too fat to fight, and the increasing incidence rates for obesity, they're projecting could be a national security issue, which I believe. Now, they wrote this report in 2010. 2 years later, they wrote a similar report called Still Too Fat to Fight. And it's 2016, and if they were to write another report, yet still too fat to fight, and I would even propose perhaps too injured to fight as well, because we know the issue of musculoskeletal injuries in the military as well. So, I like to show this slide, environmental scanning. When we look at what's happening in the military, several things that can impact readiness and several things that I think are influenced by the way we're training our tactical athletes. In the U.S. military, we're having a significant drawdown here over the last several years. At the peak of the war, our end strength was 570,000, and we're projected to go down to 450,000. Some people think even lower than that. What that simply means is that we have fewer soldiers to accomplish the mission. In addition to the drawdown, we are having budgetary constraints as well, and I think all militaries are facing that as well. You can see here, $31 billion was cut in 14, $45 billion is cut in 15. Now, superimpose this drawdown on, increased musculoskeletal injury risk, and you could potentially have a problem in terms of our combat readiness. And I'll show some slides to provide some pretty good information details on the state of musculoskeletal injuries in the military. But over the last 10 years, depending on what you read, what report, about 15 to 30% of our formation, the United States military, is medically not ready to deploy. Now, this also contributes to the healthcare issue in the U.S. as well, because the VA disability is a pretty significant part of the budget, and a significant part of that is given to veterans who have musculoskeletal disabilities in retirement. We'll talk, a fair bit about load carriage as well. We know what a significant burden that is, and that's one of the really common things that tactical athletes need to train for, whether you're male, female, is the ability to carry loads. I know Tinda here gave a talk this morning on expanded role for military and the women. How do we train for women for more combat-centric occupations? We know they're more at risk for injury. And maybe I'm painting a negative picture here, but the good news is that there are many emerging programs that are trying to address this issue. But one of the main points I want to make is that because this is so important, pretty important to employ optimal evidence-based physical readiness programs. Now, it's very fascinating. As you know, science moves rather slow, sometimes too slow for the people working in the field. So oftentimes, practitioners in the field sort of knows what works well before the researchers do. However, it's still probably vital to make sure that a program is validated by several studies. Meta-analysis is often used too before full implementation in a military setting. So what is the status of the health of our force? Now, this is a report that's available on Google. You can PDF this. This is published in November of 2015. This was published by the Army Public Health Command, but just a very fascinating look at the health readiness of our force. Now, you can see three different graphs here. So we have the Healthy People 2020 objectives, national objectives of what we should do to make sure that we have a healthy nation. And so there are guidelines in terms of sleep, nutrition, and activity. When you look at this graph here, look at the top one, which gives the data for an active duty population, which, as we know, we have mandated physical training, we have mandated body composition standards, so you would think that our fighting force is fairly healthy. But when you look at this, you can clearly see that there's several gaps and there's significant room for improvement. The top slide shows how our active duty soldiers in the U.S. Army are meeting national objectives for sleep. Over 55% on the left there, 55% of our soldiers do not meet the objectives for sleep. Only 15% do. The next slide, looking at activity, and again, we have mandated activity, yet 34%, a third of our formation, don't meet the national objectives, and only about 38% do. And then the last slide is nutrition. And again, 34% of our formation do not meet the dietary guidelines. Now, what does that translate to in terms of combat effectiveness or readiness? You can see here 17% of our formation in the U.S. Army is medically not ready to deploy. So this could be related to a number of suboptimal health behaviors, perhaps inadequate or suboptimal training, but 70% is thousands of soldiers, actually tens of thousands of soldiers in the U.S. military. You can see a quote there at the bottom of the page there by Major General Brian Line, who's the Commanding General of the Medical Research and Materiel Command, really saying that we need to get we need to address this issue. Otherwise, we're just going to not have the fighting strength to really have the readiness that we should. And again, this has been a long acknowledged effort. The prior Surgeon General had the Medical Readiness Campaign. The recently retired Surgeon General Patricia Horho had the Performance Triad Campaign, which is all targeted towards trying to change healthy behaviors in the military. Just some more data here. Now, as you look at these numbers, and I want to just draw your attention, these are medical diagnoses, so it's fairly likely these are underreported, okay? 2% of our soldiers have been medically diagnosed as having substance abuse disorders. The number's probably much higher than that, just not diagnosed. 10% have been diagnosed with a sleeping disorder, probably higher than that. 13% of our Army formation is obese. 14% have a chronic health condition. 15% have been diagnosed with a behavioral health disorder, and 32% use tobacco. So again, how does this translate into readiness? How does this translate into performing and training effectively during a given day as well? So this report, again, Health of the Force report, came up with a Healthy Installation Index. So you can go look at this report and whatever base you're assigned to. All the installations in the United States, they've scored this in terms of their health behaviors. This shows some data here at Fort Benning. But I want to draw your attention to the bottom graph there, which shows Fort Benning here in terms of how they meet these objectives for sleep, activity, and nutrition, the performance triad. Okay, now, at the Consortium for Health and Military Performance at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences, led by Patty Doyster, they came up with a Warrior Performance Score. This performance score is based on the Comprehensive Soldier and Family Fitness Global Assessment Tool, the GAT. Is anybody aware what the GAT is, or have people taken it? So it's kind of a painful sort of thing to take. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes, all sorts of health behaviors, and it gives you, some guidance in terms of how you can improve those health behaviors. So they use this GAT assessment in over 500,000 soldiers. And again, the GAT has questions that encompass social, family, emotional, spiritual, and physical aspects of well-being. And the outcome here was the Army Physical Fitness Test. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the appropriateness for that to be a good assessment of military readiness. But that is what they used. So what do you think was important? What sort of health behaviors were important for the Army Physical Fitness Test? So they came up with the Warrior Performance Scoring. And so the WPS, there are 300 points based on, 300 points for the Army Physical Fitness Test. But look at the different domains: nutrition, physical activity, sleep, psychosocial, and other variables. So this was generated by multiple regression analysis. But look at what has the biggest influence in terms of the Army Physical Fitness Test here, the BMI, body mass index, or body composition. The second most important variable is tobacco use or cigarette use. But again, you can see some other variables there with physical activity, resistance training, entered into the equation here was very important. You see other variables there for nutrition, healthy eating, breakfast, recovery, snack, and also some psychosocial variables as well. So here's a question for you, okay? When they generated this equation, what percent of the variance do you think all these variables explain with the Army Physical Fitness Test? About 14% of the variance. So that leaves a lot of the variance unexplained. Not very impressive to me, but I've been told that, with regression modeling, if you explain 15%, I've been told that that's pretty good. But I just wanted to bring your attention there. This report is based on this formula. And again, this model only explains 50% of that variance. Okay, so the Army, again, I've worked for the Army for the last 20 years, so my view is very Army-centric. The Army senior leadership has acknowledged that we do have a health performance issue, and we do have several high-level initiatives. The performance triad was the top priority of our recently retired Surgeon General, as I just mentioned. Our current Commanding General of Training and Doctrine Command, General Perkins, his main priority is a human dimension concept, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Obviously, it's very important for soldiers to be equipped with the proper fighting systems, communication systems, very important for national security, but it's really the soldier that's the center of our formation. And until we start investing into our soldiers, as we do with weapon systems and communication systems, we're probably not going to have an optimally fighting force. And then the last slide there shows, again, recently retired General Odierno, and he had a strategic studies group on human performance optimization. And one of the things they did is they projected how we're going to fight, in the future. And one of the things they project is that we're going to fight in cities, mega cities is what they're projecting, and then we're going to have smaller formations that have to be tailorable, scalable, and more expeditionary. Probably very similar to how the Marines fight, or very similar to how an ODA team might fight. In addition, Colonel Deidre Tahan, who's a physical therapist working for the Surgeon General, she's worked very extensively on the performance triad, and her strategic research project at the Army War College was talking about the professional soldier athlete, the cornerstone for the strategic land powers human dimension, a very good report that's also available online there. This shows the physical activity concept of operations at a workshop that the Surgeon General had. Dr. Kramer attended that. But essentially, 3 lines of effort. Education is going to be very important. Programmatically, it's going to be very important. But again, senior leadership buy-in or policy is going to be very important too. Now, so there are some major, senior level global initiatives here. But again, over the last 10 or 15 years, there have also been a number of individual initiatives too at division levels throughout the United States as well. This shows, a group of human performance optimization efforts that was tracked by the Surgeon General's office. This slide is several years old, and this is published in the AMID Journal, Strategies for Optimizing Physical Performance and Preventing Musculoskeletal Injuries in the 21st Century. What's very fascinating is, again, the RAND Corporation was commissioned to do a report several years ago looking at HPO efforts in the military, and one of the observations they made is that a lot of these programs appear as though they should work and should have some face validity, but they're simply not a lot of good outcome measures to quantify effectiveness. And part of the reason for this is that there's, Army-wide or military-wide, pretty poor synchronization and integration across all these people, whether it's a practitioner, researcher, or policy leader. So, again, there are some efforts to try to sort of synchronize these efforts. In fact, I attended a meeting at the Pentagon back in February, and I think I see Rob Eiserman was in the office. He attended this this meeting in the office, in the crowd here. He attended this meeting to brief the Thor 3 program. But the Pentagon realized that there was all these sort of programs, and they wanted to have some sort of method to prioritize which of these might be most effective. And to do that, they had, they deselected down from all the initiatives that are out there. You can see here the definition for physical readiness, overmatch, strength, agility, speed, and endurance. And so in order to prioritize these, they use the military decision-making process. And those of you who are familiar with that know that first thing you have to do is come up with the evaluation criteria. So when they did that, these were the evaluation criteria they came up with. Are these programs relevant? Are they scalable? Are they easy to implement? Are they effective? Probably pretty important. Do they have an assessment plan? How do we know they're effective? Could they potentially, cut down on costs? And are they efficient? So they used a decision matrix to do a pairwise comparison to compare each of these variables, and they came up with a weighting criteria, okay? Now this shows the weighting criteria, okay, and you can see which was considered the most important. Effectiveness and relevance, which sort of makes sense to me. And that was used to prioritize these programs. The next slide shows all the programs that were briefed and that were discussed. And some of you may be familiar with these programs. Quickly, I'll just go through them. The top one here, that's the Master Fitness Trainer course, Army Wellness Centers, a Brigade Physical Therapy and Forward Musculoskeletal Care. That's the notion of just pushing down physical therapy assets on the lowest level possible for acute care. That's Comprehensive Soldier Family Fitness that I just talked about, had the GAT assessment. Army Move program. The I-PREP program, which is a program in basic training to identify those soldiers most at risk and provided them some remedial training. MWR centers, the PR bar is giving soldiers a bar before they go to bed at night for recovery. Performance Tri, we've talked about. P3T is a postpartum program to try to get women back from pregnancy. And then the Thor 3 program, I have a slide for that too. Okay. Now, in addition, Health Affairs has a Human Performance Optimization Committee, HPOC, and here are some initiatives here that have been prioritized. And so again, they're trying to really drive policy, make some policy changes to improve performance in the military. So again, back in 2005, I think when Admiral Mullen first had a workshop on total force fitness, one of the major gaps that they identified was that before we talk about performance optimization, we first have to define metrics. That was a major gap, so we had a workshop just a few years ago and published this in the November issue of JSCR, where we came up with a consensus of performance metrics, over 150 total HPO metrics. You can see the different domains that we use there: physical, nutritional, psychological, cognitive, environmental, sleep, and pain. So this was really a start of the discussion, but I think more work probably needs to be done here in terms of these metrics and other functional outcomes. Okay, so again, let's talk about some of the evidence for some of the programs that are in place now. And again, Army Physical Readiness Training, it has been, a polarizing topic. Some people think it's not effective. Other people say that, hey, when it's done to fidelity, it's highly effective. But what was important in the early 2000s, again, Army leadership identified that we had more injuries than perhaps, was desired. So they worked really hard to implement a physical readiness training program. So they did a couple of things to change what was occurring previously. Number one, they tried to standardize all the calisthenic type exercises. And the way they did that, they looked at warrior tasks and battle drills and tried to come up with calisthenic exercises that mimicked what a soldier may have to do in battle. And another significant thing is they clamped down, they significantly reduced the long volume distance running, and in its place they added interval or high intensity training. So when they did this, and this was a study led by Joe Kanabik, they did show that this new program was effective for reducing injuries in both male and female trainees, and also it was successful in allowing these soldiers to be trained this way and to pass the Army Physical Fitness Test. Okay, now this is really powerful data. This is from the Health of the Force report, and again, you can see here two line graphs. The green is total injuries. The yellow is just lower body musculoskeletal injuries. But look at when the Army implemented standardized physical training right there, and look at the reduction in injuries. So again, this is very powerful data showing that when you validate a program and you implement it appropriately, you can see an impact in terms of injury prevention. So again, even though when you look at this program, perhaps we can do better, it is effective in reducing musculoskeletal injuries. So again, I've thought about this a lot, and there are some lingering questions with the way the Army does physical training right now. What specifically makes the standard physical training program superior, because they change a couple different variables there. Is the Army Physical Fitness Test the most valid measure of combat readiness? I don't think we have to discuss that too much, because I think we would all agree that the answer is no there. Importantly, is the standardized physical readiness training program optimal for highly fit and elite athletes? Is this program appropriate for Special Forces personnel? And when you look at this, are we really training like we fight? So again, for years and years, aerobic fitness, running high volume miles has been synonymous with military physical fitness. And this is largely attributed to Dr. Kenneth Cooper, there, a retired Air Force colonel that coined the aerobics craze in the 60s and 70s. But if you look at these three separate studies in the Army, the Marines, and the Navies, looking at different running mileages in each of these cases, and you can see the significant differences in running mileages. Each of these cases, performance times were similarly improved, yet with a higher running mileage resulted in many more musculoskeletal injuries. And again, this was actually a study that was, I think, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but showing the incidence rate for both men and women. As you increase running miles per week, you increase your injury rate. So one of the things that's really important, and I think for the most part we acknowledge this, but it's not always implemented in the field, is that one of the most significant control measures to reduce injuries is to limit long distance running. Now, obviously you have to have a strong aerobic base. Obviously running is going to build a certain mental resiliency, but the evidence is pretty robust and pretty strong that the more you run, the more injuries you're going to get in a military or tactical situation. Now, the next thing I want to bring to your attention to is one of the major changes in the physical readiness training. They reduced the high volume, long duration running, and in its place, they included interval training, 30, 60s, and 61, 90s. And again, that sort of training is established, is supported by the literature. Another study I like to cite frequently, this is the Burgomaster Study, published in a very high impactful journal of Physiology in 2008, but they compared two different groups, and you can see the groups here. Both groups were 6 weeks of training. One group did endurance training. You can see the total training duration there, 4.5 hours a week, which was 40 to 60 minutes of cycling every day for five days a week. 65% max VO2. In contrast, the other group did repeated bike sprints, what we call Wingate sprints, separated by 4.5 minutes of recovery, 3 times a week. So the number of times per week was reduced, and the total training duration was reduced as well. Very different training modalities. You might hypothesize you get very different training outcomes, but as you can see in the latter two bullets there, when they looked at muscle biopsies of the vastus lateralis, similar improvements, just fascinating, in mitochondrial markers for skeletal muscle carbohydrate and lipid oxidation. Now, this model has been validated and repeated in a number of different studies, but there is some strong evidence showing that that high-intensity sprint training can be effective. The one thing that hasn't quite been done yet, whether that type of training translates to a functional or military outcome. Okay, so that work has not been done yet. But Martin Jabala, he was one of our keynote speakers at the Third International Congress of Soldiers' Physical Performance in Boston, and he actually wrote a little paper here on how the military could apply this type of training. Okay, now the other evidence, again, our laboratory first worked with the military with 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell. Now this shows the model that we use. It's a public health model. You can see the 4 different phases there. Phase 1 is the injury surveillance and do a task domain analysis. Phase 2 is to assess predictors of injury performance. Phase 3 is to develop and validate a test, and then Phase 4 is widespread implementation. So this was really a model of success. This was just published this year, 2016. But what we demonstrated here is that when you get good leadership buy-in and you use a science-based approach here, you can get a reduction of about 15% in musculoskeletal injuries. And that's pretty interesting as well. I was just looking at the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health guidelines or priorities for occupations, for public safety occupations. And one of their goals is to reduce 15% of the total injuries in firefighters, police officers, EMT personnel, and corrections officers. So again, there is evidence there that goal of 15% reduction can be achieved. Some of our current work now is, Kim Beals, I know, is next door, but she's a PI in this study, working very closely with USASOC. with Ray Baer and Rob Eiserman. And again, what's unique about what we're doing now is we have our standard battery of laboratory tests, but Ray's been very innovative and very clever in developing an operator readiness test, or a series of tests that assess functional performance, maybe more so than what you do in the laboratory. So this is going to be a very unique aspect, but it's only until we start to align what we're assessing with the laboratory with what's going on in the field where we get great fidelity in terms of performance optimization. Okay, now, so what other tools are there out there that can give us information about injury prediction? Now, how many people are supporters of the functional movement screen? How many people have used the functional movement screen? So, functional movement screen, it's fairly easy to implement. A lot of people are doing it. There's a certification. A lot of people are very strong advocates, okay? But as somebody that tries to trust the peer-reviewed literature, what does the literature say? And there's a lot of reports out there, some showing that it works, some showing that it doesn't work. But when you have conflicting literature, what you probably want to go to is something called a meta-analysis. Okay, so just this year, a meta-analysis was published, okay, in a very a unique look here. So you can see the title here, and this was based on 6 different studies, met the criteria. And one of the problems with the literature of the functional movement screen, people are using different cut points, different populations, so there are some sort of method issues that make it difficult to draw comparisons across studies. But this analysis looked at 6 studies involving almost 1,800 cases. Now look at some of the data here. Look at this right there. Look at the specificity, 85.7%, which is pretty good, which is adequate, okay, looking good there. But look at the sensitivity, 25%, okay, so that's one of the major criticisms of the functional movement screen. It's simply not sensitive enough. And again, the take-home point here is from this meta-analysis, the functional movement screen provides adequate specificity, but low sensitivity, equating to an area under the curve that would provide a level of discriminatory accuracy slightly above chance. So all the time it takes to invest in a functional movement screen, you flip a coin and you're probably going to get the same level of sensitivity there. So, this is still emerging. There's probably still ways that we can improve upon this, but again, the functional movement screen isn't the answer yet. Now, any talk about performance optimization would be remiss without talking about women in the military. Now, here's a supplement that was published in January 2016, on Women in Combat, that really gives a holistic look at how we integrate women, not only physical, but reproductive health, psychosocial, nutrition, many different chapters here. And the foreword was written by retired General Cohn, who's one of the lead, senior leaders in the military that worked hard to integrate women into combat-centric occupations. And again, in 2015, last year, 60 Minutes profiled the Marine Corps' efforts there, and I thought it was a really interesting expose there. But they profiled how the Marines were integrating women enlisted side of the house and the officer side of the house. Enlisted, they were getting reports that they were doing pretty well, but the officers weren't able to make it through. The reason why is one of the requirements for a female Marine officer was to climb a rope with a rucksack. Okay, the enlisted MOS did not have that same requirement. So I thought, again, that was important. If we know, again, upper body strength and power is a limitation with women compared to men, even in lower performing soldiers, probably most of us in this room could probably design a pretty good program that would target upper body strength and power. Now, this is some data that Dr. Bill Kramer did, the Penn State study that was funded by the Department of Defense. And I just want to show you essentially the gain that can be gained over 6 months of periodized, optimized training. Now, all these training programs had a personal trainer. They were actually concurrent training, resistance training, and they also had an aerobic base as well. But what I want to bring your attention to is look at the red are the female scores as a percent of the male score after 6 months of training. And notice for load carriage, okay, one of the most significant hurdles is 100%. This was the upper body strength power program. So the point here is you've trained women, untrained women for 6 months on a periodized Cadillac program. You can improve their load carriage abilities so that they're equal to that of an untrained male. And again, this is another paper that we published with just some recommendations here based on the literature, but a few things here. 6 months of training are probably required, using a periodized program. Load carriage is important for specificity, and really innovative approaches are needed. So next, I just want to go to a Blue Ribbon panel on military physical readiness that the NSCA actually hosted back in 2013 at the TSAC conference. But they had a group of about 20 experts, and what we did is we rated some physical constructs of warrior task and battle drills. So we looked at all the warrior task and battle drills, and we looked at what physical components were important there. These are some of the things that you have to accomplish to do physically demanding warrior tasks and battle drills. What we did next is that we rated these on all the skill and health-related components of physical fitness to see what was rated the highest. So any guesses here from the audience when you look at this quickly? What fitness component might you think was the top variable or the top two? Okay, I won't keep you in suspense anymore. These are the variables, fitness variables. These were how they rated: strength and power, number 1 and 2. Okay, so that's perhaps intuitive, at least to this audience. But let's go back to the Army Physical Fitness Test. What components of fitness does it measure? It measures endurance, body composition, and aerobic fitness. So again, clearly, there are some gaps in terms of the way the militaries address fitness. Now, again, those things are being addressed in the Marine Corps. They have a combat fitness test. I know the Army is trying to roll out an OPAT test. And again, I know like Ray and some of the the Thor 3 team are trying to develop other tests to more functional fitness. So again, a lot of work has yet to be done in terms of how we assess fitness. Okay, and again, just showing here that strength and power were 1 and 2. Now, just the other thing, and again, a close colleague is Bruce Jones, who feels very strongly that all you have to do is assess somebody in their 2-mile run to give you a lot of good insight in terms of their injury risk potential and potential for performance gain. Now, with these warrior tasks and battle drills, right, in all likelihood, they're not going to be done in a singular fashion or in unison. You're probably going to have to do them in combination. So, again, the way we did this might have sort of biased the results against aerobic fitness, some aspect, right? All those warrior tasks and battle drills, you might have to do them over a period of duration that's going to rely very heavily on aerobic fitness. But when I talk about aerobic fitness, I'm also reminded of Pavel Nurmi, one of the famed Olympic runners in history. And I think before Carl Lewis, Carl Lewis broke his record in terms of number of Olympic medals. But he was a Finn, and if you know the Finns, as Dr. Kramer and I well do, they're very stoic. So when they wanted to honor him because of his Olympic achievements, in typical fashion, they unveiled a statue, and the statues to worship or to honor, Olympic, or in the nude. And he simply looked at this and said, "I don't run naked." And so, okay, why would I show this slide? But I'm convinced that if Pavel Nurmi were alive today, he would see how we're assessing physical fitness, okay, Army Physical Fitness Test, and then he would look at how soldiers perform in combat, and he would say, well, hey, we test soldiers in T-shirts and shorts, but simply they don't go into combat with T-shirts and shorts. They go into combat with a heavy external load, and again, this is a review article by Joe Knappich, and we see the loads carried throughout history. And again, talking about a systematic review, Joe Knappich also did a systematic review on load carriage, showing some load carriage studies to date here, and looking at all these different training combinations: aerobic training, upper body resistance training, lower body resistance training, load carriage specific type training, and then field-based training. And again, the effect size shows how robust the data is that it has an effect. So the summary take-home points here is obviously specificity of training. Load carriage exercise is fairly important, okay, to improve load carriage ability. Periodized training appears to be more effective than nonlinear or linear training. Upper body resistance training with aerobic training and upper and lower body training only have similar effect sizes. Again, probably showing the importance of upper body strength and power and performance. And that if you only train upper or lower body resistance training, or you only train aerobic training, you get the lowest effect size. So what does that mean? That means probably concurrent training is the solution, which is a way the Army trains. Now again, going back to the Third International Congress on Soldiers' Physical Performance in Boston, 2014, we had a fun little sort of roundtable here where we had 10 experts, 10 people that had devoted their careers to studying military physiology and performance. And we had 5 people argue that resistance training was most important for military readiness, and 5 people argued that aerobic-based training was most important for military readiness. We had a good discussion, but the consensus was that, hey, both groups had it half right, both groups had it half wrong. It's the concurrent approach, okay? And again, when you talk about how should athletes, or what kind of athletes are warfighters? Are they strength athletes? Are they aerobic athletes? Again, probably highly dependent on the mission set at the time, but they're probably hybrid athletes, and I think I coined this term from Dr. Kramer, as I've coined many things from Dr. Kramer there, but hybrid athletes, where they have to have the fitness abilities across the continuum, because you never know what the mission is going to require. Now, what's very fascinating, okay, to my knowledge, most training programs in the military are concurrent programs. Now, there is some literature, there is some concern that training concurrently might negatively inhibit strength and power development, and the literature is conflicting in that regard. But I just want to show one study, again, that we did at the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine in Natick, Mass. with the University of Connecticut, where we had a group that trained both aerobic and strength, one just aerobic. And we looked at functional outcomes. This is a graph that shows a repetitive lift and carry task, which was 10 minutes lifting a 50-pound box. You can see here the group that trained both strength and endurance had the greatest percent improvement in this functional outcome and statistically greater than the control group. So again, you look at the way we train athletes now, tactical athletes in the military, and perhaps the investment that we could make, okay, and well, this can we have a high throughput here? Is there any compromise here in the middle to have greater innovation? Now, this is a very interesting study as well. So this was a study that looked at attrition in Danish Marines, and a couple interesting points here. Number one, so the somatotype ectomorphs had the greatest likelihood of making it through the course. And in this study, they had about a 50% attrition. But really fascinating, they had their NCOs, who were experienced NCOs, experienced trainers, rated the trainees on military quality, whether they thought they had what it took to be a soldier. That subjective rating of military suitability was the best predictor of whether they made it through the course. So again, I thought that's very fascinating as well. We can do a complete physiological assessment, but again, that coach's intuition is probably a pretty important part of the equation here as well. Now, when we talk about injuries in the military, and I was talking to Jason McMillan, who's the physical therapist for NSW at lunch here, but stress fractures are a significant issue as well. And while I fully support the policy of integrating women into combat-centric occupations, I'm very concerned with the potential for greater stress fractures and injuries. We know that women are at a greater likelihood of getting injured than men. We know a lot of those injuries are from stress fractures, and that could be just devastating. Actually, it could be so severe that somebody can be discharged from the military. So I want to talk about training for optimal bone health. Now, again, when we talk about training, optimizing programs, we usually talk about muscle fitness. How many people talk about bone health and bone fitness? You do, okay.
Big problem, Mike.
Yeah. So Arium invested heavily into this over the years, and they still have an ongoing, bone health readiness project. We did a series of studies, again, in collaboration with Dr. Kramer at University of Connecticut, Natick, Mass, and Storrs, Connecticut, about an hour apart. And a couple novel aspects here. We tried to exploit different sort of aspects of program design, specifically something called the Osteogenic Index. Secondly, we use state-of-the-art imaging technologies. So when I say bone health, some may think, okay, DEXA is the gold standard to measure bone health, but there's actually a PQCT device depicted here, which is the gold standard for measuring bone density, because it can distinguish between trabecular and cortical bone density. And that's the most sophisticated way of measuring bone health. That's something that we use in these different training studies. Okay. Now, there was a really outstanding review article written in Exercise and Sports Sciences in 2003 talking about the Osteogenic Index. And this was a very fascinating paper that validated this in an animal model, and quite simply, that there are many different mechanical parameters affecting bone adaptation, and that it's driving the hydrostatic pressure gradients through the bone that is going to have the impact on the shear stress and the osteocytes and the membranes to drive bone formation. So again, you see the graph here. If you increase bone pressure, increase bone formation, you're going to see an increase in cortical and trabecular density here. A second really important point is that bone has a refractory period. With bone, not muscle, but bone, prolonged exercise has diminishing returns. So bone has a mechanostat, and you can see here this is modeled in an animal model, but after a period of time of repetitive loading cycles, bone's ability to adapt becomes desensitized. And what Roblin and Turner figured out was after about 40 loading cycles was when it appeared as though bone could no longer receive a stimulus. Now, in addition, you can see this graph here. When you talk about bone and you talk about loading bone, it becomes desensitized in just a period of seconds. Okay, so as loading cycles increase, the mechanosensitivity decreases. In addition, what he modeled, he estimated it takes about 6 hours of recovery before bone is fully restored to be able to receive that stimulus again. So consequently, exercise for bone is most effective when delivered in short bouts separated by several hours. So in the military, as we know, sometimes we have continuous operations. They're on their feet 6 to 8 hours, okay? That's not optimal for bone, and that might be one of the reasons. Standing fatigue is one theory of why we have a lot of stress fractures in the military. So we wanted to know if we design high-impact exercises that, in theory, are going to drive and produce large rates of deformation of the bone matrix, was that the best way to improve bone health? So what I'm showing you here are 4 sector analyses. This is a control group, a group that trained aerobic exercise, resistance exercise, and combined. Now this was assessed via PQCT. We also had engineers that did a sector analysis, simply dividing the sector into 6 different sectors to see where the greatest bone formation was. This is a paper that we published in 2002 that demonstrating that trabecular density of bone at the 4% site of the tibia, okay, was the earliest manifestation of bone increase that we saw. This was just 8 weeks in duration. So previous to this study, some people thought it took a year or 2 years to be able to see bone changes with exercise. But using imaging techniques, you can see changes, increases in just weeks. So one of the last things I want to leave you with is something called a futuring exercise. So if we consider 2 variables, if we consider the variable of science, okay, to what extent is the military using science to implement best practices? Are we using evidence-based, or are we using anecdotal reports? Number 1, science. The next one is leadership buy-in and leadership support, because again, we need to get the high-level leadership to have the assets. So again, if for the sake of the argument right now, if we say right now we're sort of in an amber phase because hopefully I convinced you that we do have more injuries than we would like. And so either we're using science but not having leadership buy-in, or we don't have leadership buy-in and we're using science. So a concern here, okay, we're not at an optimal ready force. What do we need to do to get to a desired status where we have a resilient, dominant warfighter? What do we need to do to optimize performance to reduce injuries? A lot of good thoughts there. And then, if we keep on the current track, the projected status could be, non-deployable, medically not ready population could even increase unless we really leverage science. And again, I think this meeting is a great example. I know a lot of people working with military populations is only until we really push out great assets are we going to improve performance. So just to wrap up here, the threats to national security we've talked about, okay, the epidemic of musculoskeletal injuries, decreased fitness and increased obesity, increasing external loads from load carriage, increased operational deployment, demanding occupations, and veteran health and wellness. And again, there are a number of different programs that are addressing these issues. Thor 3 program, we're working with the TSAC at Pittsburgh to validate that program. These are the major Army initiatives. And what's the way ahead? Okay, again, I think it's, state of the science best practices, probably really going to come down to individualizing performance. That's again, where the criticism of the military is like a one-size-fits-all sort of training approach. It's only till we really personalize and individualize programs where we get the best fidelity. Return to duty is also going to be very important. Evidence-based medicine, systems biology, and innovative technologies. So again, I thank you for your attention and would be happy to answer any questions.